Empires are not born in marble halls. They begin in wind and dust, in hunger and uncertainty, in the fragile hope of men who believe destiny has chosen them. Across the wide grasslands of Anatolia at the turn of the 14th century, where Byzantine fortresses crumbled and Mongol thunder had recently shaken the earth, a small frontier principality stood at the edge of history. It possessed no ancient capital, no towering monuments, no treasury filled with gold. It possessed only faith, ambition, and a sword sharpened by necessity. From this narrow strip of contested borderland would rise one of the longest-lasting empires the world has ever known. The question that echoes across centuries is simple yet immense. How did a minor clan of warriors transform into a dynasty that would command 3 continents and shape the fate of Europe, Asia, and Africa? To understand the Ottoman Empire, one must first understand the world that produced it. In the late 13th century, Anatolia was a fractured mosaic of Turkic beyliks, small principalities carved from the fading authority of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. The Seljuks themselves had been battered by the Mongol invasions, their political unity shattered after the devastating Battle of Kurstdag in 1243. Into this vacuum stepped local warlords, tribal leaders, and Ghazi warriors, fighters of the frontier who blended nomadic Turkic traditions with fervent Islamic zeal. The Byzantine Empire, once the unchallenged power of Eastern Christendom, was a shadow of its former glory, weakened by Crusader sack, civil war, and territorial loss. Along the porous frontier between Byzantine lands and Turkic territories, opportunity beckoned to any leader bold enough to seize it. Among the many tribal chiefs navigating this volatile landscape was Osman, son of Ertugrul. Little is known with certainty about his early life. Legend surrounds him, woven by later chroniclers eager to sanctify the origins of empire. They speak of a dream in which a great tree grew from his chest, its branches spreading across the world, shading cities and rivers beneath its canopy. Whether myth or metaphor, the dream captured the essence of Osman's ambition. Around 1299, he declared independence from the weakening Seljuk authority, establishing what would become known as the Ottoman Beylik. At the time, it was little more than a modest frontier state centered around Surgut and the region of Bithynia. Yet geography was its silent ally. Positioned near the Byzantine border, Osman's realm had direct access to vulnerable Christian territories ripe for conquest. Osman's strategy was both pragmatic and visionary. Rather than confronting powerful rivals head-on, he expanded gradually, absorbing neighboring lands and attracting warriors eager for plunder and purpose. The frontier culture rewarded loyalty and valor. Success in battle meant land grants and prestige. Osman cultivated alliances through marriage and diplomacy, integrating diverse tribal groups under his banner. His campaigns against Byzantine fortresses were not mere raids. They were calculated steps toward territorial consolidation. The capture of key strongholds such as Yenishehir provided a foundation for administration as well as warfare. By the time of his death around 1326, the Beylik had transformed from a wandering tribal confederation into a structured polity poised for expansion. Yet the true architect of early Ottoman transformation was Osman's son, Orhan. It was Orhan who captured the strategic city of Bursa in 1326, shortly after his father's death. Bursa became the first major Ottoman capital, a center of governance, trade, and spiritual legitimacy. With its fertile surroundings and thriving silk industry, it provided economic stability that fueled further campaigns. Orhan understood that conquest alone could not sustain power. Institutions were essential. He established one of the earliest standing military forces in the Islamic world, moving beyond purely tribal levies. This embryonic professional army would later evolve into the formidable Janissary Corps, though in Orhan's time it remained a modest but significant innovation. Orhan's reign marked another turning point, the crossing into Europe. In 1354, a devastating earthquake damaged the Byzantine fortifications at Gallipoli. Seizing the moment, Ottoman forces occupied the city, establishing their first permanent foothold on the European continent. The Bosporus, once a defensive barrier protecting Constantinople, became a bridge for Ottoman ambition. From Gallipoli, raids and settlements spread into Thrace. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by internal strife, could offer little resistance. European powers watched with growing alarm as a new Muslim force entrenched itself in the Balkans. The expansion was not solely military. The Ottomans practiced a flexible approach toward conquered populations. Christians and Jews were permitted to retain their faith in exchange for taxation and political submission. This pragmatic tolerance reduced resistance and stabilized newly acquired territories. The Ottomans positioned themselves not merely as conquerors, but as legitimate rulers capable of maintaining order in a chaotic age. Their frontier identity, half nomadic, half settled, allowed them to adapt swiftly to changing circumstances. Murad I, Orhan's successor, accelerated this transformation. He formalized administrative divisions and further strengthened the military apparatus. Under his rule, the Ottomans confronted Balkan coalitions determined to halt their advance. The Battle of Maritsa in 1371 demonstrated Ottoman tactical superiority. A surprise night attack shattered a Serbian force and opened the path deeper into southeastern Europe. Yet it was the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 that entered legend. On the Kosovo field, Ottoman and Serbian armies clashed in a brutal confrontation that would resonate in both Islamic and Christian memory. Murad I was assassinated on the battlefield, one of the few sultans to die in combat, but the Ottoman victory cemented dominance in the region. The significance of Kosovo extended beyond immediate territorial gains. It symbolized the irreversible shift of power in the Balkans. Local rulers increasingly accepted vassal status, providing troops and tribute to the Ottoman court. The empire's structure grew more sophisticated. The devshirme system began to take shape, whereby Christian boys were recruited, converted to Islam, and trained for military or administrative service. Though controversial and often painful for families, this system created a cadre of loyal servants bound directly to the Sultan. Merit and discipline could elevate a recruit to the highest offices of state. In this fusion of coercion and opportunity lay one of the empire's enduring strengths. Bayezid I, known as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, inherited a realm surging with momentum. His reign embodied the volatility of rapid expansion. Bayezid pushed aggressively against both Balkan principalities and remaining Anatolian beyliks, seeking to unify Turkish lands under Ottoman authority. His campaigns encircled Constantinople, placing immense pressure on the Byzantine capital. European crusaders, alarmed by Ottoman advances, launched a coalition army that confronted Bayezid at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. The result was a crushing Ottoman victory. The defeat of heavily armored Western knights at Nicopolis sent shockwaves across Europe. The Ottomans were no longer a regional threat. They were a continental power. Yet ambition carries risk. In Anatolia, Bayezid's consolidation provoked resentment among rival Turkic rulers. Beyond the eastern horizon loomed an even greater danger: Timur, the Central Asian conqueror known in the West as Tamerlane. Timur's empire stretched from Persia to India, and his armies moved with devastating speed. In 1402, the two titans met at the Battle of Ankara. The clash was catastrophic for the Ottomans. Timur's forces captured Bayezid, who died in captivity the following year. The empire teetered on the brink of collapse. The aftermath of Ankara plunged the Ottoman realm into the interregnum, a period of civil war among Bayezid's sons. Provinces declared autonomy, vassals reconsidered loyalty. For a decade, the future of the dynasty hung in uncertainty. It was a test not only of military resilience but of institutional depth. Could the structures built over generations survive the loss of a ruler? Gradually, Maimed I emerged victorious among his brothers, restoring unity by 1413. His reign focused on reconstruction, reasserting authority over rebellious territories and rebuilding administrative coherence. The survival of the dynasty after such a devastating defeat revealed a crucial truth. The Ottoman state had matured beyond the fortunes of a single leader. By the early 15th century, the Ottomans had transformed from a marginal frontier principality into a resilient, expanding empire straddling two continents. Their institutions, military, administrative, and fiscal, were becoming increasingly centralized. Their rulers balanced Islamic legitimacy with pragmatic governance. Their armies combined nomadic cavalry traditions with emerging infantry discipline. Yet one monumental prize remained beyond their grasp: Constantinople. The ancient city, though diminished, still stood as a symbolic and strategic bastion, separating Ottoman territories in Anatolia and Europe. The stage was set for a new generation of leadership that would redefine the empire's destiny. The lessons of defeat at Ankara, the consolidation under Maimed I, and the steady campaigns of Murad II would culminate in an audacious vision. The Ottomans were no longer content with incremental expansion. They sought a capital worthy of empire, a conquest that would echo through eternity. As the 15th century advanced, a young prince studied warfare, engineering, and statecraft with obsessive determination. He believed the city of Constantine was not merely a target, but a destiny promised to Islam centuries earlier. There are moments in history when ambition crystallizes into inevitability, when centuries of prophecy, strategy, and circumstance converge upon a single city. By the mid-15th century, the Ottoman Empire encircled Constantinople like a tightening noose. The ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire, once the radiant heart of Rome's eastern dominion, had been reduced to a fading relic. Its population had dwindled, its walls weathered, its influence diminished to little more than the city itself and scattered enclaves. Yet symbolically, it remained immense. To capture Constantinople was not merely to seize territory, it was to inherit Rome's mantle and proclaim a new epoch. The architect of this audacious vision was Maimed II, later known as Maimed the Conqueror. Born in 1432, he ascended the throne in 1451 after the death of his father, Murad II. Maimed was young, only 19, but his youth concealed formidable intellect and unyielding resolve. Educated in languages, mathematics, theology, and military science, he studied the campaigns of Alexander and Caesar as carefully as he read Islamic prophecy. A hadith attributed to the Prophet Muhammad declared that Constantinople would one day fall to a blessed commander and a blessed army. Maimed believed he was destined to fulfill that promise. Preparation for the siege began with meticulous calculation. Maimed strengthened the Ottoman navy, understanding that control of the Bosporus was essential. On the European shore, he constructed the fortress of Rumeli Hisari directly opposite the earlier Anadolu Hisari, effectively sealing maritime access to Constantinople from the Black Sea. The massive stone walls rose with astonishing speed, signaling Ottoman intent with unmistakable clarity. Byzantine envoys protested. Maimed ignored them. Diplomacy had given way to destiny. Within Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos faced grim reality. Appeals for Western aid yielded limited response. A handful of Genoese and Venetian contingents arrived, along with skilled commander Giovanni Giustiniani, but Europe was divided by politics and mistrust. The memory of the Fourth Crusade's sack of the city in 1204 still haunted Byzantine hearts. Now, unity came too late and in too small a measure. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman siege began. Maimed's forces numbered perhaps 80,000, dwarfing the city's defenders, who numbered fewer than 10,000. But numbers alone did not guarantee success. Constantinople's Theodosian walls had withstood centuries of assault. To breach them required innovation. Mehmed turned to artillery. Hungarian engineer Urban had offered his cannon-making expertise to the Byzantines, but lacking funds, they declined. Mehmed seized the opportunity. Enormous bombards were cast, including the colossal basilica cannon, capable of hurling stone balls weighing over half a ton. The thunder of Ottoman artillery echoed across the city, shaking walls that had once seemed eternal. Yet the siege was not a simple barrage. The Byzantines fought with desperate determination, repairing breaches each night. Ottoman infantry assaults met fierce resistance. The Golden Horn, protected by a massive chain, blocked naval entry. In response, Mehmed executed one of the most daring maneuvers of medieval warfare. He ordered ships dragged overland on greased logs, bypassing the chain and launching them into the Golden Horn behind the city's defenses. The psychological shock was immense. Constantinople was no longer shielded by water, it was surrounded. Weeks of bombardment and skirmishes wore down the defenders. Food supplies dwindled. Morale faltered but did not collapse. On May 29, 1453, Mehmed launched a final, coordinated assault. Waves of irregular troops tested defenses, followed by disciplined janissaries pressing the main breach near the gate of St. Romanus. Giovanni Giustiniani was wounded and evacuated, further weakening resolve. Emperor Constantine XI, refusing to flee, cast aside imperial regalia and fought among his soldiers. He was killed in the chaos, his body never definitively identified. As dawn broke, Ottoman banners rose above the walls. After nearly 11 centuries as a bastion of Christian empire, Constantinople had fallen. Mehmed entered the city not as a marauder but as a sovereign conscious of history's gaze. He rode to the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral, and ordered its conversion into a mosque. Yet he also proclaimed protection for the city's remaining inhabitants, seeking to restore vitality rather than reduce it to ruin. Plunder, though permitted briefly, was restrained. The conqueror understood that a capital must live. Constantinople, soon to be known increasingly as Istanbul, became the new Ottoman capital. Mehmed set about transforming it into the heart of a universal empire. He invited artisans, scholars, and merchants from across his domains to repopulate the city. Muslims, Christians, and Jews were resettled, creating a cosmopolitan mosaic. The Sultan saw himself not merely as a Muslim ruler, but as Caesar-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome. This claim to Roman legacy distinguished the Ottomans from earlier Islamic dynasties. They were not simply conquerors, they were heirs. Institutional reform followed conquest. Mehmed reorganized the administration, centralizing authority under the Sultan. The Devshirme system expanded, supplying the Janissary corps and civil bureaucracy with disciplined, loyal servants. The Imperial Council, or Divan, operated under Grand Viziers who executed policy with increasing sophistication. Land distribution through the Timur system ensured cavalry service while preventing the rise of hereditary feudal aristocracies. The Ottoman state became a machine of governance as much as warfare. Mehmed's ambitions extended beyond Constantinople. He subdued remaining Byzantine territories in the Mora and Trebizond, extinguishing the last vestiges of Byzantine sovereignty. In the Balkans, Serbia and Bosnia fell under firmer control. To the north, he clashed with Hungarian forces led by John Hunyadi, facing both victories and setbacks. In Anatolia, he eliminated rival beyliks, forging unity across the peninsula. The empire stretched from the Danube to eastern Anatolia, from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. Yet Mehmed was not solely a warrior. He patronized scholars, commissioned architectural projects, and fostered legal codification. The Topkapi Palace rose as the administrative and ceremonial heart of empire, overlooking the Bosporus with calculated majesty. Law codes, known as canon, standardized governance alongside Islamic Sharia. In this fusion of secular regulation and religious legitimacy, Mehmed crafted a durable framework for imperial authority. Foreign relations reflected calculated pragmatism. Venetian merchants, though wary, negotiated trade agreements. The Ottoman navy expanded, challenging maritime powers in the Aegean. Mehmed even contemplated campaigns toward Italy, briefly capturing Otranto in 1480. Though his death the following year halted further advance, the message was unmistakable. The Ottomans were now a Mediterranean power capable of projecting force into the heart of Europe. The conquest of Constantinople altered global history. Trade routes shifted as Ottoman control over eastern Mediterranean corridors tightened. European states intensified efforts to find alternative passages to Asia, indirectly fueling the age of exploration. Within the Islamic world, the Ottomans emerged as the preeminent Sunni power, commanding both prestige and strategic depth. The psychological impact reverberated across continents. For Christians, it was a profound shock. For Muslims, a triumphant vindication. When Mehmed II died in 1481, he left behind an empire transformed. What had once been a frontier principality was now a centralized imperial state commanding strategic cities, disciplined armies, and a dynamic capital bridging continents. Yet conquest had only begun. The structures Mehmed forged would be tested and expanded by successors who envisioned even greater horizons. Beyond Anatolia and the Balkans lay vast Arab lands under Mamluk rule, the rich trade arteries of the eastern Mediterranean, and the challenge of emerging European powers. The Ottoman story was far from complete. It was accelerating. Empires that conquer great cities must next conquer themselves. After the death of Mehmed II in 1481, the Ottoman Empire stood immense yet unsettled, its institutions powerful but not immune to rivalry. Succession within the dynasty was never a peaceful ceremony. It was a contest of survival. Mehmed's sons, Bayezid and Sem, embodied competing visions and ambitions. Their struggle would test whether the empire's foundations were truly secure or merely held together by the force of one extraordinary ruler. Bayezid II emerged victorious after a brief but consequential civil war. Sem, Sultan, sought refuge among Christian powers, becoming both a bargaining chip and a symbol of Ottoman vulnerability. European rulers, particularly the Knights Hospitaller and the papacy, understood his value. As long as Sem lived, he represented an alternative claimant to the throne. Bayezid maneuvered diplomatically, paying substantial sums to keep his brother in captivity rather than risk his return. This episode revealed a harsh reality of Ottoman governance. Fratricidal conflict was not aberration but structural feature. The stability of the state depended upon ruthless clarity in succession. Bayezid II's reign, lasting from 1481 to 1512, was comparatively cautious. Unlike his father, he did not seek dramatic westward expansion. Instead, he consolidated gains and emphasized internal stability. Trade flourished under his rule, particularly with Venice, whose merchants operated within Ottoman ports despite political tension. Bayezid welcomed Jewish refugees expelled from Spain in 1492, recognizing their commercial and intellectual value. This act was both humanitarian and pragmatic, strengthening urban economies across the empire. Istanbul, Salonika, and other cities became centers of vibrant Sephardic culture. Yet beneath this calm exterior, new forces gathered. To the east, the Safavid dynasty rose under Shah Ismail I, establishing a powerful Shia state in Persia. The Safavids posed not merely territorial threat, but ideological challenge. Their promotion of Shia Islam resonated among segments of Anatolia's Turkic population, unsettling Ottoman religious cohesion. The empire, firmly Sunni, now confronted sectarian tension that intertwined theology with geopolitics. Bayezid struggled to suppress internal revolts inspired by Safavid influence, revealing the fragile balance between frontier dynamism and centralized orthodoxy. In 1512, succession once again ignited conflict. Bayezid's sons vied for power, but it was Selim, later called Selim the Grim, who seized the throne after forcing his father's abdication. Selim I embodied relentless energy and uncompromising ambition. Where Bayezid had been cautious, Selim was decisive. He viewed the Safavid threat as existential. In 1514, he marched eastward, confronting Shah Ismail at the Battle of Chaldiran. Ottoman artillery and disciplined janissaries proved decisive against Safavid cavalry. The victory secured eastern Anatolia and signaled Ottoman military superiority grounded in gunpowder technology. Selim did not stop at Chaldiran. Recognizing the strategic importance of controlling Islamic holy cities and trade routes, he turned south against the Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled Syria, Egypt, and the Hijaz. The campaigns of 1516–1517 unfolded with astonishing speed. At the Battle of Marj Dabik, Mamluk forces fell before Ottoman firepower. Damascus submitted. Cairo followed after the decisive Battle of Ridania. Within months, centuries of Mamluk dominance ended. The Ottoman Empire absorbed vast Arab territories stretching from the Levant to Egypt. This conquest transformed the empire fundamentally. By acquiring Mecca and Medina, Selim assumed custodianship of Islam's holiest sites. The symbolic weight was immense. Though the exact moment remains debated, Selim came to be regarded as caliph, spiritual leader of Sunni Islam. The Ottoman Sultan was no longer merely a regional sovereign. He was protector of the faithful across continents. Control of Egypt also meant control of Red Sea trade routes and immense agricultural wealth from the Nile Valley. The empire now bridged southeastern Europe, Anatolia, and the Arab world in an unprecedented union. Selim's reign was brief. He died in 1520, but transformative. He left to his son, Suleiman, a realm not only territorially vast but ideologically elevated. The Ottoman state stood poised at the zenith of opportunity. Yet expansion on such scale required not only conquest but integration. Diverse populations, Arabs, Greeks, Slavs, Armenians, Kurds, Jews, lived within imperial boundaries. Governing them demanded administrative sophistication equal to military prowess. Suleiman I ascended the throne in 1520 at the age of 26. Known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent and within Ottoman tradition as Suleiman the Lawgiver, he would embody the empire's golden age. From the outset, his reign signaled continuity of expansion. In 1521, Belgrade fell after determined siege, removing a key defensive bastion in Central Europe. The following year, the island fortress of Rhodes, long held by the Knights Hospitaller, succumbed after intense struggle. The Eastern Mediterranean increasingly became an Ottoman sphere. But it was the Hungarian campaign that would reshape Europe's balance of power. In 1526, Suleiman confronted Hungarian forces at the Battle of Mohacs. The engagement was swift and devastating. Hungarian King Louis II perished, and the kingdom fractured. Buda eventually came under Ottoman control, extending imperial frontiers deep into Central Europe. The road to Vienna lay open. In 1529, Suleiman's army besieged the Habsburg capital. Though the siege ultimately failed due to logistical strain and inclement weather, the message was clear. The Ottomans had become a dominant European power. Simultaneously, Ottoman naval strength expanded under legendary admirals such as Hayreddin Barbarossa. The Mediterranean transformed into a contested arena between Ottoman fleets and Habsburg Spain. North African territories, including Algiers and Tunis, aligned with Ottoman authority, extending influence across southern shores. Maritime supremacy complemented continental ambition. Yet Suleiman's greatness rested not solely upon conquest. His legal reforms systematized imperial governance. The canon laws were refined to harmonize with Sharia, creating clarity in taxation, land tenure, and criminal justice. This codification earned him the title lawgiver. Cultural patronage flourished. Architect Mimar Sinan designed mosques and complexes that defined Ottoman architectural identity, including the majestic Suleymaniye Mosque overlooking Istanbul. Poetry, calligraphy, and scholarship thrived under imperial support. The empire's artistic and intellectual life mirrored its political confidence. Still, beneath grandeur lay tension. Prolonged campaigns strained resources. Rivalries within the court intensified. The execution of Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha in 1536 signaled the Sultan's vigilance against perceived disloyalty. Later, the execution of Suleiman's own son Mustafa, amid palace intrigue involving Hurrem's sultan, revealed the perilous dynamics of dynastic politics. The principle of fratricide remained embedded in succession logic, a brutal mechanism designed to prevent civil war but often deepening internal suspicion. By the time Suleiman died in 1566 during the siege of Shajvar, the Ottoman Empire had reached unparalleled reach. Its borders spanned from the gates of Vienna to the Persian frontier, from Crimea to Yemen, from Algeria to the Persian Gulf. It commanded pilgrimage routes, trade arteries, and strategic chokepoints linking continents. The Sultan stood as both emperor and caliph, warrior and legislator. Yet history's rhythm is unforgiving. The very scale that signified strength also demanded constant vigilance. European states were evolving militarily and economically. The Safavid rivalry endured in the east. Administrative complexity grew heavier. The question looming over Suleiman's successors was whether they could sustain the dynamism of expansion without succumbing to the inertia of magnitude. The empire had ascended from frontier obscurity to global prominence in less than 3 centuries. Now, at its zenith, it faced the timeless challenge of all great powers. Great empires do not collapse at the height of their glory. They begin, instead, to change. When Suleiman the lawgiver died in 1566 outside the walls of Shajvar, the Ottoman Empire stood vast and formidable, yet its future would no longer be defined by relentless expansion alone. The age that followed was not immediate decline, as later historians once imagined, but transformation, subtle, complex, and at times perilous. The machinery of conquest still turned, but new pressures, internal and external, began to reshape the imperial order. Suleiman's son, Selim II, ascended the throne. Unlike his father and grandfather, Selim was not a warrior sultan. Known for his preference for courtly pleasures over campaign tents, he relied heavily on capable grand viziers, particularly Sokollu Mehmed Pasha. This shift marked a structural evolution. Real executive authority increasingly flowed through the office of the Grand Vizier. The Imperial Council gained prominence as a governing body, reflecting a maturing bureaucratic state. The Sultan remained supreme in theory, but governance became more institutionalized. Despite Selim's reputation, Ottoman expansion did not cease. In 1570, the empire moved against Cyprus, then under Venetian control. The campaign succeeded, adding the island to Ottoman territory and strengthening dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. Yet the conflict provoked a formidable Christian coalition, the Holy League, comprising Spain, Venice, and the papacy. In 1571, their fleets clashed with Ottoman forces at the Battle of Lepanto. Lepanto was one of the largest naval battles of the 16th century. The Ottoman fleet suffered a devastating defeat, losing hundreds of ships and thousands of men. Across Europe, church bells rang in celebration. Lepanto was heralded as a turning point, proof that Ottoman expansion could be halted. Yet the empire's resilience surprised its adversaries. Within a year, the fleet was rebuilt. Naval power recovered swiftly, demonstrating the depth of Ottoman resources. Strategically, Lepanto dented prestige but did not cripple capacity. As the 16th century advanced, new dynamics emerged. Population growth strained agrarian systems. Inflation, driven partly by the influx of New World silver into Europe, destabilized Ottoman currency and disrupted traditional timber land grants. The once effective system that exchanged land revenue for cavalry service began to erode. Military organization adapted. The Janissary Corps expanded in number and influence. Originally an elite infantry of discipline, recruits drawn through Devshirme, the Janissaries increasingly became entrenched urban actors with economic interests and political leverage. Murad III, who reigned from 1574 to 1595, presided over a court marked by elaborate ceremony and growing palace intrigue. The imperial harem, particularly the Valide Sultan, the Queen Mother, assumed significant influence. This era has often been termed the Sultanate of Women, reflecting the political roles played by figures such as Nurbanu Sultan and later Kursum Sultan. While some contemporaries viewed this as decline, it represented another form of institutional adaptation. Power diffused within the palace rather than remaining solely in the person of the Sultan. Externally, the empire confronted renewed conflict with the Habsburgs and Safavids. The long war against Austria, beginning in 1593, drained resources and tested logistical endurance. Warfare in Hungary became protracted and brutal. Fortresses changed hands repeatedly. Neither side achieved decisive supremacy. Simultaneously, Eastern campaigns against Persia consumed attention. The Ottoman military machine, once defined by rapid offensive momentum, now fought grinding wars of attrition. Internally, unrest flared in Anatolia. The Celali rebellions, uprisings driven by economic hardship, corruption, and displaced soldiers, ravaged rural regions in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. These revolts exposed vulnerabilities in provincial governance. Banditry spread. Villages were abandoned. The state responded with force and administrative reform, yet stability required time and restructuring. Ahmed I, ascending the throne in 1603, confronted these challenges with both pragmatism and symbolism. His reign witnessed the construction of the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, known in the West as the Blue Mosque, facing the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. Architecturally, it reaffirmed imperial confidence, blending spiritual devotion with political messaging. The mosque's cascading domes and soaring minarets declared that Ottoman sovereignty remained vibrant. A crucial change in succession law occurred during this period. Instead of systematic fratricide upon accession, the dynasty began to confine potential heirs within the palace in a practice known as the caves, or cave. Princes were kept in relative isolation to prevent rebellion. While this reduced bloodshed, it also produced rulers sometimes inexperienced in governance. The balance between stability and vitality shifted. The 17th century opened with continued turbulence. Osman II attempted to reform the Janissaries after their performance in the Polish campaign of 1621 disappointed him. His efforts provoked resistance. In 1622, Janissaries revolted, deposed, and murdered the young sultan. The event shocked the empire. For the first time, the military corps had directly overthrown a reigning sovereign. Authority, once sacrosanct, had been publicly challenged. Kursum Sultan emerged as a stabilizing force during the reigns of her sons Murad IV and Ibrahim. Murad IV, taking full control in 1632, ruled with iron determination. He suppressed rebellions, restored discipline among the Janissaries, and personally led campaigns against the Safavids, recapturing Baghdad in 1638. His reign temporarily revived the image of the warrior sultan, reminding subjects and rivals alike that imperial vigor endured. Yet structural changes continued. The timur system increasingly gave way to tax farming, whereby revenue rights were auctioned to individuals who paid the state in advance. This provided immediate fiscal resources, but altered relationships between center and provinces. Wealthy notables, known as ayan, gained local power. Provincial decentralization became more pronounced, though ultimate sovereignty remained with Istanbul. Mehmed IV's long reign, beginning in 1648, unfolded under the shadow of powerful Grand Viziers from the Kurpulu family. Kurpulu Mehmed Pasha and his successors revitalized administration, enforced fiscal discipline, and pursued military campaigns that reclaimed momentum. Under their leadership, the empire achieved victories against Venice in Crete and expanded influence in Eastern Europe. The Kurpulu era demonstrated that capable ministers could restore direction even amid systemic strain. However, the drive toward Vienna resurfaced dramatically in 1683. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led a massive army to besiege the Habsburg capital. The campaign carried echoes of Suleiman's earlier attempt, but Europe had changed. A coalition of forces, including Polish King Jan III Sobieski, relieved Vienna in a decisive battle. The Ottoman army retreated in disorder. The defeat marked a watershed. Unlike earlier setbacks, recovery proved more difficult. The Holy League pressed advantage, launching counteroffensives across Hungary and the Balkans. The Treaty of Karlovitz in 1699 formalized significant territorial losses. Hungary passed largely to Habsburg control. The empire ceded Podolia to Poland and parts of Dalmatia to Venice. For the first time, the Ottomans conceded large European territories through negotiated settlement rather than temporary withdrawal. The psychological shift was profound. Expansion had defined imperial identity. Now contraction entered the narrative. Yet the empire did not disintegrate. Instead, it recalibrated. Military reforms were debated. Diplomatic engagement with European powers grew more sophisticated. Permanent embassies would soon be established. The Ottoman state, forged in conquest, confronted a new reality. Survival required adaptation to a transforming global order. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire remained vast, diverse, and resilient, but no longer invincible. Its institutions had evolved from tribal frontier beginnings into complex bureaucratic structures. Its society had absorbed countless peoples and traditions. Its armies, once unstoppable, now faced rivals. The 18th century did not begin with collapse but with awakening. After the Treaty of Karlovitz in 1699, the Ottoman Empire confronted a new and unsettling reality. It could lose. For centuries, expansion had been assumed. Defeat had been temporary. Now territorial concessions were formalized in ink, recognized by European courts as permanent shifts in balance. The empire still commanded vast lands from Algeria to Iraq, from the Danube to Yemen, yet its psychological horizon narrowed. Survival, not conquest, became the central question. Sultan Mustafa II had already been deposed in 1703 after military discontent erupted into the Edirne incident. His removal underscored a pattern. The Janissaries and provincial forces could intervene decisively in politics. Ahmed III ascended the throne amid this recalibration. His reign would usher in what later historians called the Tulip Era, a period defined less by battlefield thunder and more by cultural introspection. The Tulip Era, roughly spanning 1718 to 1730, symbolized cautious engagement with Europe. Following further conflict and the Treaty of Passarowitz in 1718, the Ottomans ceded additional territories to Austria and Venice. Yet peace created space for experimentation. Grand Vizier Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha encouraged diplomatic missions to European capitals. Ottoman envoys traveled to Paris and Vienna, observing military organization, architecture, and court culture. Reports returned to Istanbul describing printing presses, scientific academies, and urban planning innovations. Within the capital, a refined aesthetic flourished. Gardens blossomed along the Bosporus, adorned with tulips imported and cultivated with fascination. Palaces and pavilions reflected Baroque influences blended with Ottoman tradition. The elite embraced leisure, poetry, and spectacle. This was not decadence alone, it was curiosity. The empire tentatively opened itself to comparison. One of the era's most consequential developments was the introduction of the printing press in Ottoman Turkish by Ibrahim Mutafarika in 1727. Though religious texts remained restricted, secular works in geography, history, and science were printed for broader dissemination. Knowledge began to circulate in new ways. Resistance persisted among conservative scholars wary of innovation, but the seed of intellectual reform had been planted. Yet cultural refinement could not shield the state from underlying tension. In 1730, a revolt led by Patrona Halil, an Albanian former sailor, erupted in Istanbul. Dissatisfaction with taxation, economic disparity, and perceived extravagance ignited unrest. Ahmed III was deposed, and the Tulip era ended abruptly. Reform without structural security had proven fragile. Mahmud I, succeeding amid rebellion, restored order but faced renewed external challenges. The empire clashed with Persia under Nader Shah and with Russia and Austria in the Balkans. The rise of the Russian Empire under Peter the Great and later, Catherine the Great introduced a formidable northern adversary. Russia sought access to warm-water ports and influence over Orthodox Christian populations within Ottoman domains. The Black Sea region became a contested frontier. The War of 1768–1774 against Russia proved catastrophic. Ottoman forces suffered decisive defeats. The Treaty of Kusuk-Kaynarka in 1774 inflicted severe consequences. Crimea became nominally independent but effectively under Russian sway. Russia gained the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire. This clause would echo dangerously in later decades, providing justification for repeated intervention. The treaty also granted Russia navigation rights in Ottoman waters, signaling a strategic shift in the Black Sea. These losses exposed systemic weaknesses. Military organization lagged behind European advances in artillery, drill, and logistics. Provincial decentralization had empowered local notables who often prioritized regional interests over imperial directives. The treasury strained under war expenditures, yet within crisis emerged determination for reform. Selim III, ascending the throne in 1789, confronted an empire pressured by revolution abroad and stagnation at home. The French Revolution reverberated across Europe, altering political consciousness. Selim recognized that survival required transformation. He initiated the Nizam-i-Seded, New Order, a comprehensive program aimed at modernizing the military and administrative apparatus. European instructors were invited to train new infantry units modeled on Western lines. Military academies introduced updated curricula in engineering and artillery science. Financial reform sought to secure dedicated revenue streams to fund modernization. Selim established permanent embassies in European capitals, institutionalizing diplomacy as continuous engagement rather than episodic negotiation. The Ottoman state began to observe, learn, and adapt systematically. But reform threatened entrenched interests. The Janissaries, long accustomed to privilege and resistant to change, viewed the new order as existential challenge. Provincial Ayan feared erosion of autonomy. Religious authorities debated the legitimacy of adopting European methods. Reform in an empire so layered and diverse required delicate balance. By 1807, opposition crystallized. A Janissary-led revolt deposed Selim III. The reforming sultan was later murdered amid palace turmoil. His fate illustrated the peril of transformation without consolidated power. Yet the idea of modernization could not be extinguished. It lingered among bureaucrats and officers who understood the widening technological gap between the Ottoman Empire and its rivals. Mahmud II eventually emerged as the decisive reformer. Ascending in 1808 after further upheaval, he maneuvered cautiously at first, recognizing the dangers that had consumed Selim. The empire confronted simultaneous crises: Serbian uprisings, Greek nationalist agitation, and renewed Russian aggression. Nationalism, an ideology scarcely imaginable during Osman's frontier days, now challenged imperial cohesion. Subject peoples increasingly envisioned sovereign identities separate from Ottoman rule. Mahmud II grasped that incremental reform would not suffice. In 1826, he orchestrated the auspicious incident. Under pretext of military reorganization, he provoked a Janissary uprising, then unleashed loyal artillery against their barracks. The Janissary Corps, once the empire's elite guard, was annihilated. Thousands were killed or exiled. The institution that had shaped Ottoman power for centuries vanished in days. The destruction of the Janissaries marked a turning point as dramatic as the conquest of Constantinople. It removed a conservative obstacle and cleared space for systematic military modernization. A new army, disciplined and trained along European lines, emerged. Uniforms, drills, and command structures transformed. Mahmud also restructured provincial administration, curbing the power of rebellious notables and strengthening central authority. Yet reform extended beyond the battlefield. Mahmud abolished the traditional attire of the Ottoman elite, replacing turbans with the fez as a symbol of modernized unity. Ministries modeled on European counterparts were established. Postal services and census efforts expanded state capacity. The Sultan appeared publicly in new styles of dress, signaling ideological as well as institutional change. Despite these measures, territorial losses continued. Greece achieved independence in 1830 after a protracted struggle supported by European intervention. Egypt under Muhammad Ali operated with increasing autonomy, challenging Istanbul's authority. The empire survived, but its geopolitical stature had diminished. Reform was no longer optional, it was existential. By the early 19th century, the Ottoman Empire stood transformed from a conquering colossus into a state wrestling with modernity. Its rulers recognized that adaptation must penetrate law, education, finance, and military organization. The old order had been shattered. A new one was under construction. The question was no longer whether the empire could expand. It was whether it could redefine itself in a world accelerating toward industrial and ideological revolution. The stage was set for a sweeping era of reform that would attempt to reconcile Islamic legitimacy, imperial tradition, and European modernity. Reform born of crisis carries a different urgency than reform born of curiosity. By the time Mahmud II died in 1839, the Ottoman Empire had dismantled its most entrenched military institution and begun reconstructing itself along unfamiliar lines. Yet the work remained incomplete, fragile, and contested. His son, Abdülmecid I, inherited not a stable order but a blueprint, a vision of transformation that would either preserve imperial integrity or dissolve it under pressure. The 19th century was accelerating, driven by industry, nationalism, and imperial rivalry. The Ottomans could no longer afford hesitation. Only months after Mahmud's death, the empire faced humiliation at the hands of Muhammad Ali of Egypt, whose modernized army defeated Ottoman forces in Syria. European powers intervened diplomatically, wary of destabilization. It was within this precarious atmosphere that the Gülhane Edict of 1839 was proclaimed. Known as the Hat Letter 131 Sheriff of Gülhane, it inaugurated the Tanzimat, reorganization, era. The decree promised security of life, honor, and property to all subjects, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. It pledged fair taxation and regularized military conscription. Most radically, it implied equality before the law. The Tanzimat reforms were not merely administrative adjustments, they were ideological recalibrations. For centuries, the Ottoman system had organized communities under the millet structure, granting religious minorities autonomy in exchange for loyalty and taxation. Now the state sought to cultivate a unified Ottoman citizenship transcending confessional identity. The objective was strategic. By fostering equal belonging, the empire hoped to counter nationalist fragmentation and foreign intervention justified by minority protection. Implementation required institutional overhaul. Ministries expanded. New secular courts supplemented religious tribunals. Provincial councils introduced limited local participation. A modernized education system began to emerge, including military and civil academies influenced by European models. Translation bureaus brought foreign legal and scientific texts into Ottoman discourse. Railways, telegraph lines, and steamships gradually knit together distant provinces, shrinking the perceived vastness of imperial territory. Abdülmecit's reign also coincided with the Crimean War, a conflict that revealed the empire's complex diplomatic position. Russia, invoking its right to protect Orthodox Christians, advanced against Ottoman territories in 1853. Britain and France, determined to curb Russian expansion, allied with the Ottomans. The war's battles, from the Danube to the Crimean Peninsula, were brutal and costly. Though the Ottoman military still relied heavily on European assistance, the conflict ended in 1856 with the Treaty of Paris, which preserved Ottoman territorial integrity and formally admitted the empire into the European concert of powers. This diplomatic recognition was a paradox. The Ottoman Empire was acknowledged as part of Europe's state system, yet increasingly dependent upon European capital and political support. Financial modernization accompanied military reform. Foreign loans financed railways, arsenals, and infrastructure. While these investments stimulated development, they also accumulated debt that would later constrain sovereignty. In 1856, the Hat Letter 131 Humyan expanded upon earlier reforms, explicitly guaranteeing equality for non-Muslim subjects in public office and education. Resistance emerged among conservative elements who viewed such measures as erosion of Islamic primacy. Reformers argued that survival required adaptation. The tension between tradition and modernization became a defining feature of the era. Abdulaziz, who succeeded Abdülmecit in 1861, continued many Tanzimat policies while pursuing naval expansion. Under his reign, the Ottoman navy briefly became one of the largest in the world. Yet fiscal discipline faltered. Extravagant spending, coupled with declining revenues and mounting interest payments on foreign loans, deepened financial instability. By the mid-1870s, the empire faced bankruptcy. Simultaneously, nationalist movements intensified. In the Balkans, uprisings in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Bulgarian April Uprising of 1876 drew European scrutiny and condemnation of Ottoman reprisals. The Eastern Question, what would become of Ottoman territories in Europe, dominated diplomatic discourse. Russia positioned itself as protector of Slavic and Orthodox populations, preparing for confrontation. In 1876, amid financial crisis and political agitation, reformist bureaucrats and intellectuals, known as the Young Ottomans, pressed for constitutional governance. They believed that a representative system could unify diverse subjects under shared citizenship while preserving imperial authority. Abdulaziz was deposed. Murad V briefly reigned before being declared mentally unfit. Abdülhamid II ascended the throne and, under pressure, promulgated the Ottoman Constitution of 1876. A parliament convened, marking the empire's first experiment with constitutional monarchy. But events overtook aspiration. In 1877, Russia declared war. The Russo-Turkish War proved disastrous. Russian armies advanced deep into the Balkans and approached the outskirts of Istanbul. The Treaty of San Stefano imposed severe terms, creating a large autonomous Bulgaria under Russian influence. Alarmed, Britain and Austria-Hungary intervened diplomatically. The Congress of Berlin in 1878 revised the settlement, reducing Bulgarian territory but confirming independence for Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania. Bosnia came under Austro-Hungarian administration. The Ottoman presence in Europe shrank dramatically. Confronted with fragmentation and humiliation, Abdülhamid II suspended the constitution and dissolved parliament in 1878, inaugurating 3 decades of autocratic rule. Yet his governance was not static reaction, it was strategic consolidation. Abdülhamid embraced pan-Islamism, emphasizing his role as caliph to rally Muslim solidarity across imperial domains and beyond. Telegraph networks expanded rapidly under his direction, enhancing central oversight. Railways, including the ambitious Hejaz Railway, sought to strengthen pilgrimage routes and integrate Arab provinces. Education became a key instrument of statecraft. Secular schools multiplied, producing bureaucrats and officers versed in modern science yet loyal to the Sultan. Censorship tightened, surveillance intensified. Abdülhamid balanced modernization with control, wary of liberal currents that had destabilized Europe. His reign stabilized finances temporarily through renegotiation of debt under the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, though at the cost of foreign supervision over revenue streams. Meanwhile, pressures persisted. Armenian communities demanded reform and protection amid escalating violence in the 1890s. European criticism mounted. In Crete and Macedonia, unrest simmered. The empire's diversity, once a source of strength, now required delicate management amid rising ethnic consciousness. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had undergone profound transformation. It possessed railways and telegraphs unimaginable in Osman's time. It had experimented with constitutionalism and retreated into centralized autocracy. It had joined Europe's diplomatic system while losing territory to nationalist movements. Reform had strengthened institutions yet exposed contradictions. The Tanzimat had sought to create Ottoman citizens. Pan-Islamism sought to forge Muslim unity. Nationalism sought separation. Competing visions of identity coexisted uneasily within imperial borders. The state remained vast, but cohesion was fragile. A new generation of officers and intellectuals, educated in reformed academies and influenced by global ideologies, watched closely. They admired technological progress and constitutional governance elsewhere. They questioned autocracy and inefficiency. Within barracks and bureaucracies, dissatisfaction grew. The empire stood at a crossroads between centralized control and renewed constitutionalism. The question was no longer whether reform was necessary. It was who would direct it and toward what end. The 20th century loomed, promising upheaval on a scale even greater than the conquests of Mehmed or the reforms of Mahmud. Revolutions often begin not with gunfire, but with whispers in classrooms and barracks. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire stood suspended between reform and repression. Sultan Abdülhamid II had preserved territorial integrity longer than many expected. Yet his regime of surveillance and censorship suffocated political expression. Beneath the surface, a generation shaped by modern education and global awareness contemplated change. They were officers, bureaucrats, journalists, men who believed the empire could survive only through constitutional revival and national rejuvenation. Foremost among these reformists was a clandestine movement known as the Committee of Union and Progress, commonly called the Young Turks. Operating initially in secrecy, they organized cells within the military, particularly in the empire's European provinces such as Salonika. These regions were exposed to nationalist ferment and European political currents. The Young Turks admired constitutional models and believed that reinstating parliamentary governance would unify diverse populations under shared Ottoman citizenship. In 1908, events accelerated. Faced with the prospect of foreign intervention in Macedonia and emboldened by coordinated military mutinies, the Young Turks forced Abdülhamid II to restore the constitution of 1876. Crowds celebrated in Istanbul and across the provinces. Christians and Muslims alike hailed promises of liberty and equality. The second constitutional era had begun, yet idealism confronted immediate challenges. Counter-revolution erupted in 1909 when conservative factions and disaffected soldiers in Istanbul revolted, demanding restoration of autocracy. Troops loyal to the Young Turks marched from Salonika and suppressed the uprising. Abdülhamid II was deposed and replaced by his brother Mehmed V, who reigned as a largely ceremonial monarch. Real power increasingly shifted to the triumvirate of Young Turk leaders, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Semel Pasha. The empire's geopolitical environment remained unforgiving. In 1911, Italy invaded Ottoman Libya, seeking colonial expansion. Despite spirited local resistance, including guerrilla efforts by officers such as Mustafa Kemal, Libya was lost. The Italo-Turkish War revealed limitations in projecting power to distant provinces. Even more devastating were the Balkan Wars of 1912–1913. A coalition of Balkan states, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, attacked Ottoman territories in Europe. Within months, centuries of Ottoman presence in the Balkans unraveled. Cities that had once symbolized imperial ascendancy fell in rapid succession. Salonika, birthplace of the Young Turk Revolution, was lost to Greece. Adrianople briefly fell before partial recovery. Refugees flooded Anatolia, carrying trauma and resentment. The empire's European dominion shrank to a thin strip around Istanbul. These defeats radicalized the Young Turk leadership. They increasingly embraced Turkish nationalism as cohesive force, shifting emphasis from inclusive Ottomanism to a more ethnically defined identity. Centralization intensified. Opposition parties were suppressed. The state grew more authoritarian even as it proclaimed constitutionalism. Amid this turbulence, global war erupted in 1914. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand ignited alliances that engulfed Europe. The Ottoman leadership, wary of Russian ambitions and enticed by German promises of military support, entered the First World War on the side of the Central Powers. The decision would prove fateful. Ottoman forces fought on multiple fronts. In the Caucasus, Enver Pasha launched a disastrous winter campaign against Russia at Sarikamish, resulting in catastrophic losses. In Mesopotamia, British forces advanced from the Persian Gulf, seeking control of oil resources and strategic routes to India. In Gallipoli, however, the empire achieved a rare triumph. Allied forces attempted to seize the Dardanelles and capture Istanbul. Ottoman defenders, commanded by officers including Mustafa Kemal, repelled the invasion after months of brutal combat. Gallipoli became a symbol of resilience and sacrifice. Yet the war's darker chapters unfolded internally. In 1915, amid fears of Armenian collaboration with Russia, the Ottoman government initiated mass deportations of Armenian populations from eastern Anatolia. What followed was widespread suffering, death, and atrocity. Historians debate terminology and intent, but the human toll was immense and enduring. The Armenian tragedy remains one of the most painful legacies of the empire's final years. As the war dragged on, economic hardship intensified. Famine struck parts of Syria and Lebanon. Arab leaders, encouraged by British promises, launched revolts against Ottoman rule. Sharif Hussein of Mecca declared rebellion in 1916, seeking Arab independence. The empire's cohesion fractured under strain of total war. By 1918, the Central Powers were collapsing. Ottoman armies retreated on multiple fronts. British forces captured Jerusalem and advanced toward Damascus. Bulgaria's surrender exposed Ottoman territory to further invasion. In October 1918, the Armistice of Mudros ended hostilities. Allied forces soon occupied Istanbul. The once mighty empire stood defeated and dismembered. The Treaty of Sevres in 1920 proposed drastic partition. Greece would control parts of western Anatolia. Armenia would gain territory in the east. France and Britain would administer mandates in Syria and Iraq. The Ottoman state would be reduced to a narrow Anatolian core under foreign oversight. For many Turks, the treaty signified national humiliation. Yet surrender did not conclude the story. Within Anatolia, resistance coalesced under Mustafa Kemal, hero of Gallipoli. Rejecting both occupation and compliance, he convened congresses in Erzurum and Sivas, forging a nationalist movement determined to defend sovereignty. The Ottoman government in Istanbul, constrained by Allied presence, appeared powerless. Dual authorities emerged, imperial and nationalist. The ensuing War of Independence from 1919 to 1922 transformed defeat into rebirth. Nationalist forces repelled Greek advances in western Anatolia, culminating in decisive victory at the Battle of Dumlupinar. French and Italian forces negotiated withdrawals. Armenian and Kurdish questions were contested amid shifting fronts. The nationalist Grand National Assembly in Ankara asserted legitimacy over imperial institutions. In November 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was formally abolished. Maimed VI departed Istanbul into exile. The empire founded by Osman more than 6 centuries earlier ceased to exist as sovereign polity. Yet its administrative heritage, cultural synthesis, and geopolitical legacy persisted. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 replaced Sevres, recognizing the sovereignty of the new Republic of Turkey within defined borders. On October 29, 1923, the Republic was proclaimed with Mustafa Kemal, now Atatürk, as its first president. The Caliphate, symbol of Ottoman religious authority, was abolished in 1924. A secular nation-state replaced a multi-ethnic empire. Thus ended the Ottoman Empire, not in a single collapse but through war, revolution, and reinvention. Its fall reshaped the Middle East and southeastern Europe. Mandate borders drawn by European powers would sow future conflict. National identities hardened. The imperial tapestry unraveled into nation-states whose destinies would intertwine for generations. Yet history resists simple endings. When empires fall, they do not vanish. They echo. They leave behind borders drawn in haste, cities layered with memory, and peoples shaped by centuries of shared rule. The abolition of the Ottoman Sultanate in 1922 and the proclamation of the Republic of Turkey in 1923 marked the political end of a dynasty that had endured for more than 600 years. Yet the consequences of that ending would reverberate far beyond Anatolia. The Ottoman Empire did not simply collapse. It fragmented into a new geopolitical order whose tensions would define the modern Middle East and southeastern Europe. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk approached state building with deliberate rupture. He believed that survival required radical transformation. The institutions of the Ottoman past, Sultanate, Caliphate, religious courts, were dismantled. In 1924, the Caliphate was abolished, severing the symbolic link that had once positioned the Ottoman Sultan as leader of Sunni Islam. Islamic law was replaced with secular legal codes modeled on European systems. The Latin alphabet supplanted Arabic script. Education was centralized under state authority. Clothing reforms discouraged traditional Ottoman attire in favor of Western dress. These reforms sought to anchor the new republic in secular nationalism rather than imperial pluralism. The Ottoman model had governed diverse communities through layered autonomy. The Turkish Republic pursued homogeneity. The shift was profound. Where the empire had balanced religious identities, the Republic elevated a singular national narrative. For Anatolia's Muslim Turkish majority, this meant consolidation. For minorities, Armenians, Greeks, Kurds, it meant new complexities and tensions. Beyond Turkey's borders, former Ottoman provinces underwent their own transformations. The Arab lands once administered from Istanbul became mandates under British and French supervision. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine were shaped not solely by local aspirations, but by European strategic interests. Artificial boundaries cut across tribal and sectarian lines. The Ottoman administrative districts that had once allowed flexible governance were replaced by fixed nation-state borders. In Iraq, a British-backed monarchy struggled to unify Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish populations under a centralized framework. In Syria and Lebanon, French authorities fostered divisions even as nationalist movements grew. In Palestine, competing promises to Arab leaders and Zionist settlers laid foundations for protracted conflict. The absence of Ottoman imperial mediation left power vacuums that external actors filled unevenly. Meanwhile, in southeastern Europe, the Balkans consolidated into independent states: Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, later Yugoslavia, Romania, whose identities had crystallized in opposition to Ottoman rule. Yet their internal ethnic mosaics mirrored complexities once managed within imperial structures. Interwar tensions and later global conflicts would expose unresolved fractures. The memory of Ottoman governance lingered ambiguously. For some communities, it represented stability and coexistence. For others, repression and stagnation. In cities like Sarajevo, Thessaloniki, Damascus, and Jerusalem, architectural remnants testified to centuries of layered authority. Mosques, bridges, bazaars, and administrative buildings stood as silent witnesses to a shared past that nationalist narratives often minimized. Within Turkey, Ataturk's reforms accelerated modernization, but demanded sacrifice of continuity. The abolition of religious courts redefined social norms. Women gained expanded rights in education and suffrage. Industrialization efforts aimed to reduce economic dependence, yet the transition was not seamless. Rural populations adapted slowly. Kurdish revolts in the 1920s and 1930s reflected resistance to centralized secular nationalism. The Republic enforced unity with determination reminiscent of imperial authority. Globally, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire altered balance of power. Britain and France briefly dominated Middle Eastern politics, but their mandates faced persistent resistance. The Second World War further destabilized colonial control. By mid-century, independent Arab states emerged, yet inherited borders and governance challenges rooted in post-Ottoman arrangements. The legacy of the Ottoman military tradition also persisted. Officers trained in imperial academies shaped early republican institutions. Administrative habits, centralized bureaucracy, provincial governance structures evolved rather than disappeared. Even as rhetoric emphasized rupture, continuity endured beneath the surface. Religious authority, though stripped of political power in Turkey, remained influential across former Ottoman territories. The Caliphate's abolition created a vacuum in Sunni leadership that has echoed through subsequent decades. Movements seeking to revive or reinterpret Islamic governance often invoked Ottoman memory, whether as idealized golden age or cautionary tale. Economic patterns bore imperial imprint. Trade routes once aligned toward Istanbul shifted orientation toward European capitals. Yet ports like Beirut and Izmir retained commercial significance rooted in Ottoman integration. Railways constructed in the late empire facilitated 20th century development, binding regions in ways unintended by nationalist architects. Cultural influence transcended borders. Ottoman cuisine, music, and linguistic borrowings permeated societies from the Balkans to the Levant. Shared legal traditions influenced early constitutional experiments. The empire's pluralistic millet framework offered historical precedent for managing diversity, even as modern states struggled with minority rights. In the decades following dissolution, global conflicts repeatedly intersected with Ottoman legacies. The Arab-Israeli conflict unfolded within territories once administered by Istanbul. Kurdish aspirations traversed multiple successor states, challenging rigid national boundaries. Balkan wars in the late 20th century revived memories of Ottoman coexistence and division alike. Turkey itself navigated complex identity between Europe and Asia. Membership in NATO during the Cold War positioned it within Western alliances, yet historical ties to Middle Eastern neighbors endured. Debates over secularism and religion, democracy and authority, often traced implicit lines back to imperial transformation. The Ottoman story thus became more than historical chronicle. It became framework through which modern political identities were negotiated. Some viewed the empire as cosmopolitan model, unjustly maligned by nationalist historiography. Others saw it as relic of autocracy, incompatible with modern sovereignty. Both interpretations carried fragments of truth. As the 20th century progressed, scholarship reassessed earlier narratives of inevitable decline. Historians emphasized adaptability, administrative sophistication, and global integration. The empire was no longer portrayed solely as the sick man of Europe, but as complex polity navigating unprecedented pressures. Its longevity, spanning from 1299 to 1922, testified to institutional resilience rarely matched in world history. Yet longevity did not shield it from transformation's cost. The First World War, nationalist revolutions, and geopolitical partition dismantled imperial cohesion irreversibly. What replaced it was a mosaic of states whose destinies intertwined with imperial inheritance. The Ottoman Empire's end, therefore, signified not disappearance but metamorphosis. Its structures dissolved into new political forms. Its cultural memory persisted. Its unresolved questions resurfaced in modern conflicts. The narrative that began with a frontier beylik in Anatolia culminated not only in conquest and governance, but in the shaping of contemporary geopolitics. Empires measure their success in centuries. Their legacies endure longer still. The Ottoman dynasty no longer ruled from Istanbul's palaces, yet the world it helped shape continued to wrestle with its consequences. Understanding that legacy requires looking beyond battlefield triumphs and diplomatic treaties to the lived realities of millions whose identities were forged under imperial canopy. The echo of Osman's dream, of branches spreading across continents, did not end with the tree's fall. It persisted in roots embedded deep within the soil of 3 continents. To grasp the modern Middle East, the Balkans, and Turkey itself, one must reckon with those roots, tangled and enduring. History rarely grants empires the luxury of defining their own memory. After the Ottoman Empire dissolved, its image was contested, reshaped, and repurposed by the very states that emerged from its remains. In the 20th century, the Ottoman past became battleground of identity, invoked, rejected, romanticized, or condemned, depending on political need. The empire that once governed 3 continents now survived primarily in narrative. Yet narrative, in the modern age, is power. In the Republic of Turkey, the early decades were marked by deliberate distancing from the Ottoman legacy. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's reforms sought to construct a forward-looking national identity anchored in secularism and Turkish ethnicity. The imperial past was often depicted as stagnant, overly religious, and responsible for decline. School textbooks emphasize the Republic as rebirth after centuries of decay. Ottoman sultans, once revered as caliphs and conquerors, became symbols of a bygone order replaced by rational modernity. This reinterpretation was strategic. To consolidate a new nation-state from imperial debris required a cohesive narrative. Ottoman pluralism, once a pragmatic method of governing diversity, did not align easily with the Republic's emphasis on unified citizenship. The empire's multi-ethnic complexity risked undermining nationalist consolidation. Thus, public memory narrowed. The grandeur of conquest gave way to celebration of Republican revolution. Yet even as official discourse minimized imperial nostalgia, Ottoman architecture continued to define Istanbul's skyline. The domes of Suleimani and the minarets of Sultan Ahmed stood as constant reminders that history could not be erased. Cultural practices, from cuisine to music, carried Ottoman lineage into everyday life. Beneath the rhetoric of rupture, continuity persisted quietly. Elsewhere, former Ottoman territories constructed their own interpretations. In Arab lands, narratives often framed Ottoman rule as foreign domination that suppressed Arab aspirations. The Arab Revolt of 1916 became cornerstone of nationalist memory, portraying liberation from Turkish control. Yet historical scholarship gradually complicated this view, revealing periods of cooperation, shared administration, and integrated elite networks. Many Arab intellectuals of the 19th century had thrived within Ottoman institutions. The relationship had been layered, not simply oppressive. In the Balkans, memory diverged sharply. For Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria, independence struggles were central to national mythology. Ottoman rule was remembered as centuries of subjugation. Monuments commemorated uprisings. Folk songs preserved tales of resistance. Yet in cities like Sarajevo or Skopje, Ottoman-era bridges and bazaars remained functional parts of urban life, silent witnesses to intertwined histories. The Armenian tragedy of 1915 emerged as one of the most contentious legacies. For Armenians, the deportations and mass deaths constituted genocide, a defining trauma shaping diaspora identity. In Turkey, official recognition remained deeply contested. The dispute influenced diplomatic relations and domestic debate, illustrating how imperial collapse left unresolved wounds. During the Cold War, geopolitical alignments further shaped Ottoman memory. Turkey's integration into Western alliances emphasized republican identity over imperial heritage. Meanwhile, Middle Eastern states navigated post-colonial politics under leaders who sometimes invoked Ottoman decline as cautionary example against fragmentation. Yet toward the late 20th century, perceptions began to shift. As globalization accelerated and ideological rigidities softened, historians revisited Ottoman archives with fresh perspectives. Rather than viewing the empire solely through lens of decline, they examined its administrative adaptability, economic networks, and cultural pluralism. Comparative studies positioned the Ottomans alongside Habsburgs and Romanovs as early modern multinational empires grappling with modernization. Within Turkey, public interest in Ottoman history resurged. Television series dramatized the lives of sultans, museums expanded exhibitions, restoration projects revived imperial architecture. Political leaders occasionally referenced Ottoman heritage as source of soft power and regional connection. The term Neo-Ottoman entered political vocabulary, sometimes as praise, sometimes as criticism. This revival was not mere nostalgia. It reflected strategic recognition that Ottoman legacy linked Turkey historically to the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Middle East. Diplomatic outreach often emphasized shared past. Cultural festivals celebrated common traditions. Yet invoking empire carried risks. neighboring states wary of dominance sometimes interpreted such gestures cautiously. In the broader Middle East, Ottoman history became reference point in debates about governance. Some commentators contrasted imperial pluralism with post-colonial instability, arguing that Ottoman administrative flexibility had once balanced sectarian diversity more effectively than modern centralized states. Others rejected this interpretation, highlighting inequalities and episodes of repression. Academic discourse increasingly portrayed the empire as integrated participant in global economy. Trade networks connected Anatolian producers to European markets and Indian Ocean routes. Diplomatic correspondence revealed sophisticated engagement with European powers. Far from isolated, the Ottoman state was embedded in early modern globalization. The reevaluation extended to military history. Scholars examined how Ottoman use of gunpowder technology in the 15th and 16th centuries placed it among pioneering gunpowder empires. The Janissaries, once symbols of stagnation, were reassessed as innovative institutions that adapted over centuries before ossifying. The Tanzimat reforms were interpreted not as desperate imitation, but as deliberate engagement with international norms. Yet public memory rarely aligns perfectly with scholarship. Popular narratives simplify. In some regions, the empire remains shorthand for tyranny, in others, emblem of lost unity. These divergent memories influence contemporary politics. Balkan tensions occasionally resurface through rhetoric referencing Ottoman centuries. Middle Eastern conflicts unfold within borders drawn from Ottoman provinces. In Turkey itself, debates over secularism and religion echo 19th-century reform tensions. Discussions about the role of Islam in public life, the balance between central authority and local autonomy, and the orientation toward Europe or Asia resonate with imperial precedents. The Ottoman experience serves as both resource and warning. The empire's demographic and cultural legacy also persists in diaspora communities. Turkish populations in Germany, Arab communities in France and Britain, Balkan Muslims across Europe, all carry threads of Ottoman past interwoven with modern migration. Cuisine, language, and memory traverse continents, extending imperial cultural footprint into new contexts. As the 21st century unfolds, the Ottoman Empire occupies complex space between history and identity. It is studied not only as political entity, but as civilizational bridge linking continents. Museums in Istanbul, Sarajevo, and Cairo display artifacts once confined to archives. Digital scholarship opens imperial documents to global audiences, democratizing access to sources long overlooked. The question that began with Osman's frontier beylik, how did a small principality rise to command 3 continents, now evolves into another. How does such an empire live on after its political death? The answer lies in institutions transformed, borders inherited, and memories contested. Empires are measured not only by the lands they conquer, but by the legacies they leave. The Ottoman Empire's endurance for over 6 centuries allowed it to shape patterns of governance, culture, and diplomacy that outlived its sovereignty. Its fall did not erase its influence, it redistributed it. Thus the Ottoman story continues, not in imperial decrees or cavalry charges, but in classrooms, parliaments, and public debates across regions once united under its banner. Its legacy remains active terrain, shaping perceptions of identity, power, and coexistence. Empires are mortal. They rise from uncertainty, expand through ambition, govern through adaptation, and ultimately yield to forces they cannot fully control. Yet some leave imprints so deep that centuries cannot erase them. The Ottoman Empire, born from a modest frontier principality at the edge of a crumbling Byzantine world, endured for more than 600 years. Its history traversed conquest and reform, brilliance and brutality, unity and fragmentation. To understand its legacy is to confront the enduring question that shadows all great powers. What remains when sovereignty ends? The Ottoman story began with opportunity amid collapse. In the late 13th century, Anatolia was fractured by Mongol disruption and Byzantine decline. Osman and his followers seized space created by instability. They blended nomadic warrior ethos with Islamic legitimacy and pragmatic tolerance. Geography favored them, discipline sustained them. From Surgut to Bursa, from Gallipoli to Kosovo, their expansion was incremental yet relentless. Institutions emerged alongside victories, ensuring that territory translated into governance. The conquest of Constantinople in 1453 symbolized transformation from frontier state to imperial civilization. Maimed II's vision fused Roman imperial heritage with Islamic authority. Istanbul became a cosmopolitan capital linking Europe and Asia. Administrative systems matured, military innovation advanced. The Ottoman Empire no longer reacted to opportunity, it shaped it. Under Selim I and Suleiman the Magnificent, expansion reached continental scale. The incorporation of Arab lands and the guardianship of Mecca and Medina elevated the Sultan's religious authority. The empire controlled vital trade routes, commanded formidable armies, and cultivated artistic and architectural achievements that defined an era. It stood as one of the early modern world's great gunpowder empires, alongside Habsburg Spain and Safavid Persia. Yet longevity required more than conquest. As European powers industrialized and global commerce shifted, the Ottomans faced structural pressures. Military setbacks such as Lepanto and Vienna signaled limits. Economic inflation and administrative strain challenged traditional systems. Reform became imperative. From the Tulip era's cautious cultural engagement to the Tanzimat's sweeping legal restructuring, Ottoman leaders attempted to reconcile tradition with modernization. The 19th century intensified these challenges. Nationalism redefined loyalty. Industrial warfare magnified technological gaps. The empire sought constitutional governance, experimented with parliamentary rule, and oscillated between reform and autocracy. Abdulhamid II's centralized control coexisted with infrastructural modernization. Railways and telegraphs bound provinces even as separatist movements grew. World War I delivered the decisive rupture. Military overextension, internal fractures, and global alliances overwhelmed imperial resilience. The Armenian tragedy, Arab revolt, and Allied occupation compounded collapse. The abolition of the Sultanate in 1922 ended dynastic rule that had persisted since Osman's declaration of independence in 1299. Yet the Ottoman experience did not vanish, it metamorphosed. The Republic of Turkey emerged from imperial ashes with secular nationalist identity, reshaping institutions while inheriting administrative frameworks. Former provinces became independent states, their borders often drawn without regard for older Ottoman patterns of coexistence. Mandate systems and colonial ambitions introduced new dynamics into regions long governed from Istanbul. The Ottoman legacy thus resides in paradox. It was an empire of conquest that practiced pragmatic pluralism. It maintained Islamic legitimacy while administering Christian and Jewish communities. It fostered architectural grandeur and literary refinement alongside rigid hierarchy. It endured through adaptability, yet ultimately could not outpace industrial modernity and nationalist fragmentation. What distinguishes the Ottoman Empire from many contemporaries is not merely its scale, but its duration. 6 centuries allowed generational reinvention. The Devshirme system produced administrators whose loyalty was institutional rather than tribal. The Millet framework accommodated diversity without demanding homogenization. Legal codifications under Suleiman balanced religious law with imperial decree. Tanzimat reforms, though contested, sought universal citizenship decades before many European states embraced similar concepts. At the same time, unresolved contradictions persisted. Succession struggles bred instability. Military elites resisted reform. Economic dependency deepened in the face of European industrial power. Nationalist aspirations, once peripheral, became central challenges. No empire, however adaptive, could indefinitely reconcile expansionist origins with modern sovereignty. The Ottoman case illuminates broader truths about imperial governance. Power rooted solely in conquest eventually confronts limits. Power reinforced by institutions endures longer. Cultural integration can foster stability, yet identity remains potent force. Reform must balance innovation with legitimacy. Too slow invites stagnation. Too abrupt provokes revolt. The Ottomans navigated these tensions for centuries, sometimes successfully, sometimes fatally. In contemporary discourse, the empire's memory oscillates between nostalgia and critique. For some, it represents an era of coexistence across religious lines. For others, a symbol of autocratic stagnation. Both interpretations simplify. The Ottoman reality encompassed dynamic trade networks, evolving administrative practices, intellectual exchange, and episodes of repression. It was neither utopia nor caricatured decline, but living polity responding to shifting global currents. Its physical legacy endures vividly. Mosques designed by Mimar Sinan define skylines. Bridges across the Balkans continue to span rivers first unified under imperial administration. Culinary traditions blend Anatolian, Arab, and Balkan influences. Language itself bears Ottoman imprint, layered with Persian and Arabic vocabulary reflecting centuries of cultural synthesis. Politically, the empire's dissolution shaped modern geopolitics. The borders of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and the Balkan states emerged from its fragmentation. Many contemporary conflicts trace roots to arrangements following its fall. Understanding those origins requires acknowledging imperial structures that preceded them. Yet perhaps the most enduring Ottoman legacy lies in its demonstration of historical fluidity. A small frontier beylik rose to global prominence, a vast empire adapted for centuries before yielding to transformation. Its narrative resists inevitability. It reminds us that political forms are contingent, shaped by leadership, circumstance, and imagination. Osman's dream of a tree spreading branches across continents was metaphorical prophecy of expansion. But trees also shed leaves, adapt to seasons, and leave seeds. The Ottoman Empire's branches receded. Its seeds became nations. Some flourished peacefully, others struggled. The soil of 3 continents still carries imprint of its roots. For historians and citizens alike, the Ottoman story offers perspective on endurance and change. It cautions against assuming permanence in power, yet affirms capacity for reinvention. It reveals how governance across diversity can sustain stability, yet how identity politics can unravel it. It demonstrates that reform, though risky, is often essential to survival. In the end, the Ottoman Empire was neither solely a dynasty of conquest nor merely a relic of decline. It was a civilization that bridged epochs, from medieval frontier warfare to industrial global conflict. Its rise altered medieval balance. Its fall shaped modern world. Empires pass, but their lessons remain. The Ottoman experience invites reflection on how societies manage diversity, pursue reform, and confront change. It asks whether power can adapt faster than the forces reshaping it. And it reminds us that history's greatest transformations often begin in the most unlikely places, on windswept frontiers where ambition meets opportunity. The dynasty of conquest has ended. The legacy of endurance continues.